Only qualified personnel who are familiar with the appropriate national code or local codes, practices, and standards should install, repair, maintain, or adjust electrical motors and their accessories. Personnel operating the motor should use all the necessary personal protection means, as indicated by the laws and regulations of their country. For a proper understanding, it is necessary to carefully read the Motor Use and Maintenance Instruction Manual, available for download from the MGM website www.mgmrestop.com or www.mgmelectricmotors.com, as well as watching the following video. Maintenance operations must be performed by qualified personnel after having disconnected the motor or the machine from the electrical supply, including any possible motor auxiliary supplies with special reference to the anti-condensation heaters. The brake might become ineffective during the maintenance operations. Throughout the maintenance procedures, ensure that no load is applied to the motor drive shaft. Avoid contact with the brake motor frame, as the temperature under normal operating conditions might exceed 50 degrees centigrade. Make sure that the motor has cooled down before proceeding with any operation. Do not use repaired or altered motor components. Only new OEM components can be used as replacement parts. Installation and maintenance personnel must immediately notify their superior of any product defects or anomalies found. The installation and maintenance personnel must not allow any motor operation until all possible problems are solved and when it is safe to operate the motor. BA Series Brake Disc Replacement Instructions. Make sure that the brake disc type is suitable for the intended brake motor application, verifying if a K-brake disc is necessary, for example, hoisting, jacking, crane, and other critical applications. This instruction doesn't apply to flywheel brake disc type, BAPV series, and for double disc brakes, BAF series. Brake disc replacement instruction. Loosen and remove the rear hex nut. Remove the brake cover. Remove all accumulated brake lining material dust by vacuuming. Disconnect the brake coil connectors. Unscrew the lock nuts. Pull the brake coil off the brake adjusters. Remove the nuts and the springs. Pull the moving element off the brake adjusters. Slide the brake disc off the shaft spline. Before replacing the brake disc, it's always necessary to check the shaft spline condition, with particular reference to the wear, where the brake disc slides. If the shaft spline is evidently worn, then it's necessary to replace the rotor shaft. Insert a new brake disc into the shaft spline. Make sure that the brake disc is inserted from the correct side. Handle the brake disc with clean hands. Even a small trace of grease will decrease the braking performance and will increase braking noise. K-discs must always be inserted on the shaft spline from the hub most sticking out side. Insert the brake moving element. Make sure to insert the brake moving element with the eventual tie rod's headroom lining up with the motor tie rods. Insert the springs. Insert the spring holding lock nuts. The brake torque is proportional to the spring compression and can be adjusted by adjusting the spring holding lock nuts. Measure the spring compression with a caliper. On request, MGM can supply the charts indicating the torque values and their corresponding spring compression values for each motor type. These charts provide indicative information only. Therefore, once the brake adjustment operation is completed, it's necessary to verify that the brake torque is set to a value suitable for the application. Adjust each spring holding lock nut to adjust the brake torque to the required value of the application. In this case, the operator is adjusting the spring compression to a value of 16 millimeters. Check with the caliper that the spring compression is even across all the brake adjuster studs. Once the brake torque adjustment is completed, it's necessary to verify that the brake torque is set to the required value and suitable for the application. Never exceed the maximum brake torque setting indicated on the nameplate. Never adjust the braking torque to values lower than 30% of the maximum indicated value. BA series brakes can be equipped with either 3 or 6 springs, depending on the different brake types. Ensure that you refer to the correct spring compression brake torque chart for the motor size being adjusted. We recommend performing periodical inspections on the brake in order to verify that the braking torque is kept within the required values. Generally, it's advisable to perform the first inspection after a short period of functioning, run-in period, since it's in the first working period where you can have the greater deviation in this value. Afterwards, schedule the succeeding periodical inspections with longer intervals. The inspection frequency is strictly related to the particular application of the motor. However, after the first inspection, it's recommended to perform the following checks in at least 6-month intervals. Screw the brake coil nuts on each brake adjuster. Make sure that both the moving element core surface and the brake coil core surface are clean, and remove any foreign bodies. To remove the dust, use a vacuum. Put the brake coil onto the brake adjusters. Connect the 2 brake coil connectors. Make sure that the connectors are properly aligned in order to allow connection of one side into the other. Verify that the connectors and their relevant cables are tightly fastened. Insert and screw the brake coil lock nuts on each brake adjuster. Proceed with the air gap adjustment. The air gap is the distance between the brake coil and the brake moving element. The air gap must always stay within the values indicated in the tables found in the BA series user manual. Loosen, but don't remove the nuts and the lock nuts from all the brake adjuster studs, so that the brake coil can slightly slide up and down on the studs. Make sure that the nuts are not holding the brake coil and that the brake coil presses against the moving element. Before adjusting the air gap, make sure that all the brake coil lock nuts are loosened. Insert a feeler gauge with a thickness corresponding to the lower value of the air gap allowed range, as shown in the BA series user manual, between the brake coil and the moving element next to the brake adjuster. Tighten the nut and the lock nut until the feeler gauge is slightly pinched, but not stuck between the 2 surfaces. To check that the air gap doesn't exceed the allowed range, use a feeler gauge 0.15 millimeters thicker than the one used at the previous step. On a properly set air gap, the slightly larger feeler gauge shouldn't be able to enter the air gap. Perform the same operation at the other 2 adjuster studs, located 120 degrees from each other. Don't insert the feeler gauge in the gap generated between the 2 magnetic core faces of the brake coil. In fact, the feeler gauge must be inserted right under the magnetic core face. If the brake is equipped with 6 brake adjuster studs, the air gap has to be initially adjusted only on a subset of 3 adjuster studs, located at 120 degrees from each other. Only once this operation is completed on the first subset of adjusters, proceed in operating the air gap adjuster nuts of the 3 remaining studs, in order to have the nuts slightly pressing against the brake coil. Finally, secure the brake coil by tightening all the top lock nuts. For the final tightening, it's always recommended to first operate the underneath brake adjuster nut, then the top lock nut. Checking the air gap. If the air gap is properly adjusted, a feeler gauge with a thickness corresponding to the lower value of the allowed range will easily enter the air gap. Now, use a feeler gauge 0.1–0.15 millimeters thicker than the one previously used, and make sure that it doesn't enter the air gap. It is important to check the air gap in 3 different spots, 120 degrees apart, next to the brake adjusters. The air gap must be even all around the brake coil. If necessary, perform the previous steps multiple times in order to properly set the air gap. Once the air gap adjustment is completed, make sure that all the nuts are tightened on each brake adjuster. If one of the nuts wasn't properly tightened during the process, it's necessary to check the air gap again. Slide the brake cover back into its position, making sure that the brake coil cables and connectors are properly positioned under the brake cover, between the brake coil and the moving element, in order not to have them dragging against the brake disc or on the brake flywheel. Insert and tighten the brake cover rear hex nut. Make sure that the brake disc is free to rotate without any scraping noise when powering the motor and the brake. When powering the brake coil should attract the brake moving element with a quick stroke and hold it without any vibration or noise. In case of vibration, check the following. The terminals are properly connected. The air gap is even and properly set. There are no foreign elements including dust on the brake. Brake springs are properly compressed. The brake is powered with the right voltage.